afternoon, and good evening for wherever you are. Today we are here again for our part 3 series of podcasts. So if you look at, we divided the entire podcast in 3 different series. The first series was Art of Science of Carveout and Joint Venture. And we had the first session, which was more on very basic one. The second one was more prospecting from buyer and sellers. The third one today, we are addressing employee transition challenge in Carveout and Joint Venture. We have 3 guests, and Chuck, I think you know very well through part of Mercer, Joint Venture Group lead. We also have our new guest, Andrew. Andrew is part of Go Global, and he's part of Global M&A and Private Equity Services. And I will welcome all of you to come to this podcast today. And maybe if you can give just one-liner introduction and start with Andrew.
Great, thanks, Dharmendra. Andrew Lindquist, partner with Go Global. I have spent most of my adult life helping companies expand and operate internationally. Spent 9 years in Asia and a handful of years in Europe. I've managed teams from Beijing to Paris. I've made a lot of mistakes I try to help our clients avoid in their process of international expansion. I spent a few years with KPMG's deal advisory team, and have carried that experience over to helping companies, particularly with carve-outs, and giving them options to stand up and operate in new countries around the world. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks. Maybe Chuck, I think I know people know you, but if you can just give one-liner.
Yeah, thanks, Dharmendra. Chuck Mort, partner in Mercer's M&A practice, and I am the global leader for our specialty carve-out group. Pleased to be here again today. Thanks, Dharmendra.
Thank you. We have Dhruv.
Thanks, Dharmendra. Yes, partner with Mercer's M&A advisory team, leading the joint venture specialty group, closely working with Chuck. And I've also had the pleasure of working with Andrew in the past. So I'm glad to be here.
Sure. So thanks, everyone. And today we are going to address, most critical employee transition challenge in Carveout and Joint Venture. So my first question to Chuck is, just if you can just describe a typical global deal from a geographic perspective. Workforce distribution is the main focus, and what makes this type of deal challenging. So maybe I'll ask Chuck to answer this.
Thanks, Dharmendra. Yeah, so through our experience of working on, let's see, dozens of global transactions, we found a very common characteristic and structure for these global deals. And typically what you have, and let's just say we have a US-based multinational that's doing a transaction, a carve-out and or a JV in 20 countries. The characteristic of that is typically there's 3 to 5 countries that have a significant population, so heavy concentration of people. So that's 3 of the 5 of the 20. Then probably the next 10 to 12 will be mid-size countries, and maybe, that's 100 or a couple hundred people. So still significant operations for standalone operations, things of that nature. And then there's what we like to call the onesie, twosie countries that are around the world that are part of the deal. And in a lot of cases, they present the most challenge. And we'll get into this a little bit more through the discussion. And where they're challenging is because in many cases, these onesie twosies are high impact employees that are significant to the company's value, the deal value, and the ongoing success of that carve out in the JV. But that's the general framework we see, each with its attended interesting issues and challenges.
So what are the human capital drivers for the deal success? If you can just give some idea.
Yeah, thanks. So as we think about that too, and this goes back to the framework we at Mercer have been evaluating and constructing over time, again through our experience on hundreds of deals, have identified 7 key value drivers that are present in every transaction. Sometimes they vary, of the importance, depending on the type of deal, the type of carve out of the JV, or the pay where we happen to be in the transaction itself. But those 7 drivers of value include number 1, org design and governance. How's the organization structured, going to be managed, led, and where's the decision-making authority? The next 2 are integrated. So then there's the leadership, second lever, third lever, overall talent, and the workforce itself, and what's the skill, capabilities, competencies of the people in the deal itself. Fourth lever is everything around total rewards, compensation, benefits, policies, programs. The 5th and 6th levers are also highly integrated. The 5th one being culture, 6th one being change management and communications. The 7th lever is around HR, operating model, and structure. So those 7 factors and the content, structure, strategy around those are the significant value drivers we find in an organization. Now, there is an 8th, and the 8th one is that organization's capability to actually execute on a transaction through those levers. So as we work with clients and as we advise across the board, and then if you put it through that lens of small, large, medium, small transactions, those factors come into play around how do you structure the organization across large, medium, and small? Where's your leadership and talent structure going to look like? Total rewards varies tremendously from large, medium to small countries, and what you can do and not do with having a global philosophy. And then how do you just wrap that all together to really give a uniform view of culture, change management, communications? So those are the elements that we look at to really drive value in an organization.
Right. Thanks, Chuck. So Dhruv, now I'll come to you. Would like you to focus more on leadership and talent levers. What are the key issue and consideration to address in Carveout and JVs?
Yeah, sure. So as Chuck mentioned, with these types of transactions, right, you have an entity that's carving out from a larger conglomerate or a larger parent. And so those C-suite roles and often the functional leadership roles don't actually exist in the carved out business, right? What you're getting is typically either business unit leaders that are coming in to lead this new organization. And very often, you may have some dedicated functional leaders coming, but often these roles have to be filled. So first and foremost, there is that leadership vacuum or gap, or maybe a lack of, strong capabilities at the top if those leaders have not actually run their own businesses, right, in a C-suite role. So that has to be addressed. And if you take the JV angle to it, often what happens is leaders are seconded to stand up the JV and often return back to the parent company. So you may have this interim leadership structure before you get to that final state leadership structure. So that is a critical element that has to be addressed from a transition perspective. Then if you take the key employees below the leadership level, right, there are many employees that might be mission critical, not just to stand up the carved out entity or the JV, but then for the ongoing success of that business. And they may feel like they're often employees because they're not part of the parent company anymore. They don't understand or know or have determined the new company's culture. And so there's this period where there is a lot of uncertainty. So you've got to be able to convince those employees to move over and to be able to provide them with attractive packages to take that level of risk. So that's another one. So looking at things like their overall employment and compensation packages, the benefits, and then in addition, structuring some sort of a bonus, a retention bonus to at least keep them, to stabilize the organization and keep them until, either the JV partner or the new owners have a good handle of the business is another critical issue. And then, we also, Chuck, alluded to this, like the shared service structures that normally are provided at the parent level, at the seller's level. Not all of that can be replicated in the new coin. It's not probably appropriate to replicate all of that in the new organization, depending on these, the small, medium, large size countries. And so just understanding what that future state looks like, but then understanding who's actually going to be in the deal perimeter. So who's actually coming over, right? Both from a business standpoint as well as a functional support standpoint. Where are there open roles and gaps, that need to be filled to stand up this organization day one? So again, identifying those gaps in talent and then quickly filling them would be another critical, element to look at.
Yeah, so good points. And also it has to be done with the size of organization, like I think you already mentioned. So it's same process for either you do a smaller side JV or the bigger side JV, or it has any, in your experience, how it is?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is in a lot of these types of transactions, you will have a combination. So there'll be some countries with large employee headcounts, some with medium, some with small, and you often have to address the issues for all of them, right? Many often buyers or JV partners might think that in these small headcount countries, they're easy to deal with. They actually end up becoming more complex because the point I mentioned earlier, it's not easy to replicate everything that the parent was providing for like a 5-person country, right? And so, we worked with Andrew in particular on a couple of solutions to address those. So,
yeah, I think just picking up on that point, not only the capabilities, but also just the experience and the knowledge in some of these countries. Employment laws are going to look very different in Europe than they do in the US or in Asia Pacific countries. So a lot of times that knowledge doesn't come over with a transaction as well, and so that needs to be replicated in one form. And a solution like employer of record or using a third-party provider can help in bridging that gap, if you will.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, for your point. So I have next question to you. Maybe you can answer them. Given that in many cases there is a critical talent in some of the, a small headcount country, as you mentioned, in country location, but the buyer may not have the existing legal entity or may not want to create a new legal entity where these employees reside. How does a company address that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of options, and I guess another factor there is also the timing of the deal. So in some countries, it could take 6 months or longer to have a fully operational legal entity to create it from new. So there are options. Employer of record, or otherwise called EOR, is one option, and that's where a third party like a Go Global would employ these workers and talent on the buyer's behalf, and essentially become an extension of the buyer's HR team. So they handle all the compliance in country. They have HR support in country for the workers and also for the client. Another option there would be what's called a non-resident payroll. It's really in Europe and a handful of other countries around the world where that's a viable option. And that's essentially just a payroll registration. So it's less than setting up a legal entity. It's essentially registering a foreign company in that country for payroll, and being able to hire and pay folks through that mechanism. Different considerations there for both of those models. In terms of speed, employer of record is the fastest. That can be set up relatively quickly. In terms of the non-resident payroll, that can take weeks. So timelines are a consideration, and then what the employee experience is going to look like. So an NRP may be an option if you have workers that are hesitant to work for a third party, or if it's a client ambition to employ all these workers directly. NRP may be an appropriate option. If speed and having that dedicated HR resource is a priority, then employer of record may be a better option.
Yeah, so I was coming to this question only, that what are some worker transition considerations to take into account? We can either you do EOR or NRP. So basically you answered partially.
Yeah, I think there's a few other considerations besides
Yeah.
just the timing. So in both cases, if you've got like C-suite executives, they may not be the appropriate vehicles, and you may end up having to set up an entity. The business needs are another thing to consider. So if you're going to have direct billing in a country, you're going to need to set up a legal entity in that country. So employer of record or an NRP may not be an appropriate option in those cases. I think the other things to think about, and this would be, whether or not you're setting up an entity or not, is if there's expats in a transaction.
Yes.
Those may not be appropriate, again, for employer of record and for an NRP, because there wouldn't be a legal entity to sponsor those visas. So those are some considerations. And then I think obviously the ability to execute on an ongoing basis. So what options does the company have to support those employees? Those are things to think about. I think the other thing is, what is the transition method going to be for these workers? In the case of an employer of record, it's a third party. So it's not a straight transfer of the employment process. Oftentimes there's kind of two scenarios. It's a terminate and rehire, or a resign and rehire, and both of those options have different pluses and negatives for the acquirer. Obviously, in the case of a resign and rehire, you can mimic terms of their contract, bring seniority over, tenure over, and that may be preferred in terms of keeping the talent in place.
Yeah, to that, and I'll jump on one quick thing and tie one of your earlier questions, Tremenda. What are some of the challenges of these deals? We talked about small, large, medium, small headcount countries. Many organizations tend to push the small headcount countries off to the side for later because they think it doesn't really represent a large impact to the deal or the people and things of that nature. And our experience shows, and we've done this a number of times with Andrew and Go Global, is our experience shows that that couldn't be further from the truth. Because if we go back to the premise, in a lot of cases, high value employees in critical geographic locations that are part of the strategic impact for the organization. And because they're high impact, in many cases, high paid critical people, making sure that the appropriate, what I like to call the care and feeding of these workers is important, and the transition is important. It's important. It takes sometimes several months to sort all of that out from beginning to end. And so that ends up to be a fire drill unless it's focused early. So I urge people to not push that off to the side to do it later because they think it's easy because it's only a few people.
That's right. And a lot of times these markets with the small headcounts, those are newer markets. They've just maybe ventured in, and that's potentially where future growth and new investment is going to come into play. So not getting it right from the beginning could be, set the deal back in terms of some of the deal goals.
Yeah, and not to mention, many times the head counts and the employee census keeps changing, right, as the deal progresses. So sometimes you're not even sure if that entity, if that country, you are going to have an entity or not, or are there going to be employees or not, because it's such a fluid situation. So I think for all these reasons, early interventions, or at least early focus and prioritization of some of these small headcount countries with critical employees is really crucial to the deal.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now I'm coming to Chuck now, and maybe Dhruv, you can add. So more broadly, if you look at, I wanted to know, how do companies ensure business continuity and workforce engagement in Carveout and JVs? So maybe you start with Chuck.
Yeah, thanks, Tremenda. I'll actually start off with the overarching answer to that, and it's comprehensive and thoughtful communication strategy, which we could probably do a podcast on our own just on that one. But in the interest of time, we'll keep it short and focused. But for business continuity and workforce continuity, it really does start with a very thoughtful, comprehensive communication plan and strategy. That communication plan and strategy should really focus on what we like to do is stakeholder mapping. and start to look at the key workforce segments in an organization, understand who they are, what their key issues are, where the key risks, what the message that needs to be provided to them are, right? So let's take two segments in that stakeholder mapping. Segment one could be the customer facing employees. So that gets to business continuity. We want to make sure that the people that are touching the customer and are involved with the commercial operations really understand what the deal is about, what their employment terms and conditions are about, get them comfortable and stabilized so they represent that to the customer. The second element of ensuring business continuity is making sure your business operations work uninterrupted, and the people and the leaders associated with that, whether it's supply chain, manufacturing, strategic sourcing, R&D, that they're stabilized as well. Third, and so they understand what their role is, what the responsibility are, what the gaps are, what the messages need to be. Third group, and I'll kick it over to Andrew to talk a little bit about this. The third group could be those small headcount country EOR workers that are a very specific stakeholder group that need key messages because how they're impacted in the transaction.
Yeah, Chuck, that's a great
comment there.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, thinking of your employer of record as really an extension of the buyer's HR team is really important. So getting them familiar with the local team, understanding that they've got HR support in country, and almost that as a benefit as to why you've used an employer of record, so that the workers themselves have that HR support in country and a go-to contact. I think that's critical, being able to understand the local customs and also regulations, but being able to speak to the talent in their own language is another key aspect of that. So those are critical aspects that we look at, introducing ourselves as the legal employer, but also really an extension of the buyer's HR team, and getting the workers comfortable with that arrangement, talking through their new contracts and what that means, how seniority may have been transferred over, how tenures come over. Those are all critical aspects of getting the talent comfortable, with the employer of record arrangement.
And I can just round that out with two additional points from a workforce engagement perspective. So one is, I briefly talked about culture, being very deliberate about the culture that you're creating for the new organization and making sure that employees are bought in and have a voice in shaping that culture, I think goes a long way in driving up the employee engagement. And then at a more tactical level, employees really do care about like how they're going to be paid and how they're going to be, rewarded from an overall compensation perspective as well as benefits, right? And in these small headcount countries, very often what you're going to find is it's going to be hard to replicate what the parent was providing. So again, being very thoughtful and deliberate about, how are you going to make up for any shortfalls and how you're going to create a compelling rewards package and an employee value proposition for these employees will also go a long way in driving up workforce engagement.
Drew, that's a great point. So understanding that it's going to be, in a lot of cases, impossible to match benefit for benefit, but ensuring that the talent is made whole overall, and that their overall, total compensation, total rewards package is as good or better under the new arrangement, I think is also a critical part in terms of that transition.
Yeah. Any other point, Chuck?
I was actually going to tie a couple of the points together on the small headcount country and employee engagement. In a lot of cases, these are critical employees that are driving commercial operations and sales for a company. And so, if we are not doing a really strong job of articulating the employment value proposition, making sure that those workers are stabilized, that they are comfortable with what their pay benefits are going to be and they can do their job. We have to stabilize them first, which has a direct impact on stabilizing our commercial operations for either the carve out and stand up or the JV. So it's all very interconnected.
Right. So I think thanks everyone for and all the points. I know, Chuck, the topic is very touchy, and overall, if you look at, this is I think this we have been doing day and night. I think we wanted to learn more from you and share to our audience. We'll come out with some other topics similar to that, where we'll take more time from you to go more deeper. I know that we did 3 series of podcasts. Still, there are a lot of points we have not touched, but I know that today was more touchy point, and I think it's very relevant for people who are in Carveout and joint venture. Thanks, Andrew, for your additional input, and this is really great points. You brought something to our listeners and also to the team. We'll connect back again. Thanks, audience, for listening. The podcast will be available to you in a few days. And if you have any question to any of our speakers, directly you can drop an email, or LinkedIn. We have our connections. I'll be sharing everything on LinkedIn and our social media channels. Feel free to reach out for any additional information you are looking for. I know these are very, very important aspect of joint venture and carve out, and we need to be very careful where you are planning your compensation for your next employee in all countries. So thank you again, and see you again very soon.
Thank you.